everyone. Thank you so much for being patient. Nick Dranias, got it right, Nick Dranias actually has had a crazy journey to get here to speak here at IU Maurer, so it's great that we're going to have him here today. He is the president and executive director of Compact for America Educational Foundation, Incorporated. He has a limited side practice of law and policy analysis, and he previously was the general counsel and constitutional policy director for the Goldwater Institute, which is a phenomenal institute. If you don't know a lot about it, you should definitely go Google it after, learn more. And he's here today to discuss the defense of private civic engagement. I'm sorry that my voice sounds so awful, I'm getting sick. But please welcome him here to Maurer.
Should I stand at a podium here?
You can do whatever you would like.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming. This presentation, this speech is going to be all about what I call private civic engagement, the idea that we have a First Amendment right to engage in politics and in political speech privately, anonymously. And this idea is becoming increasingly seemingly radical. So radical that in Wisconsin, there has been something that looks like the East German Stasi effort to stamp out any degree of confidential coordination among center-right political groups and policy groups. I don't know if you guys have been following this in Wisconsin, but basically a rogue prosecutor used something called a John Doe investigation to secretly wiretap, secretly seize emails from virtually every center-right organization there is to try to prove a case of illegal coordination of campaign finance contributions to Governor Walker. Because there was just no other way that a guy like Governor Walker could win politically without something illegal going on. And it got to the point where they even sent a paramilitary team to the home of one of the major donors of one of the major policy groups, a gentleman named Eric O'Keefe, to seize his records in the dark of night. Over what? Over possibly illegally spending too much money on free speech? Yeah, in this country. So the thing to understand is that this is a very real threat. The threat that the center-right faces right now is not, yet limited to just the IRS. I mean, it is something that aggressive prosecutors on the center-left are using to go after their political opponents and to destroy them. Let me give you another example. The Center for Democracy and Progress had a thing called the Netizens Meet in the Phoenix area about a year ago. It was sort of a group of center-left organizations, and one of the things they focused on was how effective the Goldwater Institute was. And rather than tackle the ideas that we advanced at the Goldwater Institute, policy measures that we support, they decided, and we got quotes and they were reported that they just want to destroy us. They literally just want to take out the think tanks by any means necessary. And the reality here is, when you combine this with Dick Durbin's effort to haul in front of a Senate committee anybody in the think tank world on the center right that had anything to do with ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, because of the Stand Your Ground law that was so controversial a year ago, you have the center-left right now in a position of power doing virtually everything that they ever accused the McCarthy-era center-right doing in the 1950s. And you have also, fortunately, a wide body of case law that they developed in the 1950s and 60s to stop this behavior on the center-right, which is going to defend us, but not as well as we would think. Because one of the biggest problems we face is the status of the ability to engage in free speech, free political association confidentially today is in greater doubt than ever before because of our conservative jurists, the people who wrote the Citizens United opinion. Now, who here is familiar with Citizens United? Everybody? Who here thinks Citizens United completely deregulated campaign finance law so that now corporations run everything? All right, well, here's reality. Citizens United only said that independent expenditures, uncoordinated expenditures, cannot be limited just because they come from a corporation or a union. And the particular fact pattern dealt with a docudrama or documentary on TV that was advocating against the merits of Hillary Clinton's candidacy. And the then current campaign finance law actually made it illegal to have that on TV within a certain time frame of an election. And so the actual fact pattern in Citizens United was in an effort to outright censor free political speech over a public medium because it was too close to an election, because it might be effective. And so the court struck that down. And frankly, I think anybody who thinks that that's the wrong result, they need to answer the questions that the court asked of the persons who are justifying that behavior. Do you ban books when they're too close to an election? Do you ban pamphlets when they're too close to an election? I mean, what's the principal distinction between, in our modern era, a documentary and any of those other forms of expression? And since when did the effectiveness of speech become something that justifies suppressing it? This is a huge turning point issue that could have gone the wrong way and would have signaled, in principle, the end of free speech in our society, in this country. And the court held their ground and said, no, you cannot ban speech of that nature just because it's from a group of individuals who've incorporated or they've organized themselves as a union. People retain their free speech rights no matter how they're organized, no matter whether it's a corporation or an unincorporated entity. They retain their free speech rights because there is nothing but people in the end that are doing these things. But the court's ruling did not offer the same protection for free speech when it came to disclosure and disclaimer. Now, one of the issues that you see the right to private civic engagement arise in is when you have to disclose who is funding things like that documentary. And the FEC rules that were at issue in Citizens United required the top, I can't remember if it was the top 5 or 10, a little too tired right now to remember the exact fact pattern, but it required a certain number of the contributors to the group, the Citizens United group that made the documentary, to be disclosed in a compulsory way in the video and in reports. And the concern in that disclosure, as expressed by Citizens United, was that they'd be subject to retaliation because politics ain't beanbag. And there are good reasons in our political era where government has such immense power that you wouldn't want people to know that you're opposing their political aspirations, especially if they had a realistic shot at getting into a position of power. Well, they tried to make that argument, and the court shot it down. The court, Justice Kennedy, basically said, "I'm not buying it. There's just not enough of a fear that you have. You don't rise to the level of the kinds of threats that the civil rights movement faced in the 1950s and 60s, and so you got to man up. Just take the heat." And believe it or not, this attitude that you have to man up, just take the heat with disclosure, originates today with Justice Scalia. That's Scalia's basic framework in jurisprudence. His framework is, you got to take the heat. That's what it means to be a citizen. You got to just, if people blast you for your opinions, if they retaliate against you, if they shut down your business, or if the government comes after you with a John Doe investigation, that's just the price of being a citizen. Man up. Now, the problem with this perspective, ironically coming from conservatives and then targeting conservatives on the center left, is it's exactly the opposite of the founding era understanding of what free speech entailed. And let me give you an example. One of the things that my SSRN paper discloses, I think for the first time, is a detailed analysis of the printing press licensing acts of the 16th and 17th centuries, 17th century, mid-17th century in England. To just back up, the whole idea of freedom of the press, the words freedom of press that you see in the First Amendment was in comparison to what existed in England in the 1600s. They had a series of licensing requirements for anyone who had a printing press. And these licensing requirements had essentially two components. And the funny thing is that modern legal jurisprudence has only ever focused on one of these two components, and it actually was one of the least important aspects of these licensing regimes. The only thing that you ever read about is the fact that in order to get a license, that once you had a license, that there would be a degree of substantive censorship that could happen. That a regulator in Britain could decide that your speech was too blasphemous, or that was too much like an insurrection, or But the reality is in practice, in the 1600s, that's not really where they cracked down in Britain. It wasn't that they were really blocking a huge amount of blasphemous or rebellious type speech. Where the biggest crackdowns were coming in the 1600s was in the practice by licensed printers, not unlicensed printers, of attributing false names, anonymous names to those who authored these pamphlets and books. And that's because the other big component of the licensing regime was that they had to disclose in a variety of different ways, not only their identity, but the identity of the author. And when they failed to do so, they were prosecuted, persecuted, when they used these anonymous names to hide the author of these works, far more often than you have any record in history of actual censorship. And so the one interesting thing that folks have to understand is that structurally, this disclosure mandate, this reporting mandate that existed in these licensing acts, structurally is very similar to what we do and take for granted in campaign finance law today. And if we're originalists and we believe that the original meaning and the public understanding of the First Amendment is what should govern us, whatever may be the case actually, but if that's what should govern us, then certainly that experience of the licensing acts being primarily abused to stamp out anonymous speech should inform our understanding of what freedom of speech and freedom of press was meant to be. So the reality is this, folks, and you can take a look at my article. The original meaning of the First Amendment was directed to these licensing acts. Those licensing acts, the primary abuse that many of these folks were concerned about was the effort to stamp out anonymous speech, not just the censorship element. The censorship element was just one of the aspects that they were concerned about. And so when we look at our campaign finance laws, and we realize that folks are being forced to disclose their identities when they don't want to, just for engaging in independent speech, there should be no question from an originalist perspective that this violates the protection of free speech that the First Amendment was designed to handle, regardless of where the current case law is. So the question is, how do we get back to that understanding? How do we convince a guy like Scalia, of all people, that the right answer isn't you just man up and take the heat. The right answer is to do what the founders intended, which is protect people if they want to be private in their political engagement. Well, the way that I think we need to do that is to build out the current exception that does exist. Because as I indicated before, you can argue for an exception for mandatory disclosure if you can prove a level of retaliation that the court thinks is, I guess, dangerous enough. But we don't really have any guidance as to what that will be beyond like actual threats of bodily harm. Anything like an economic threat, we just don't know where the court stands. And every time that there is an economic threat type case, the court doesn't seem very impressed with it at any level of the system. So the question is, how do we make that exception the rule? How do we apply it in a more effective way so that eventually the court system sees that the exception should be the rule and that the rule is wrong? You know, the last time this was done, by the way, was in overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. I mean, there was a very long time when separate but equal was accepted as the proper way of looking at race relations from a constitutional perspective, and it took a sustained effort by the predecessors of the NAACP and then later the NAACP's litigators. It took a sustained effort over decades to get courts to recognize that the exception to that rule should indeed be the rule, that the rule itself, in practice, could never generate equality in the sense the Constitution protected, and therefore had to be overturned. Now, the problem with that model, of course, is that in the decades that the sustained effort to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson happened, the culture was changing in a favorable way. It was favoring less racial discrimination. It was favoring more skepticism of this idea of separate but equal. And so when it ultimately was overturned in Brown in the 1950s, the culture was ready for that. The problem we face today is that our culture of suppression of speech is getting worse. The toleration for more privacy in your political engagement is diminishing. And what's worse is, free speech, as bad as discrimination is, I mean, free speech is lost the moment that you are chilled from exercising your free speech. And the system itself, which requires a marketplace of ideas to operate freely, can be destroyed when you start depriving people who have things to say and contribute of the ability to do so freely. So the challenge we face is that the trajectory we are on right now, unless we get to this recognition that the exception of anonymous speech should be the rule, the trajectory we're on is to see more of these John Doe investigations, more of these Dick Durbin mandatory or quasi-mandatory efforts to haul people in to testify before the Senate, not less. And by the time that chill sets in, you could radically restructure our political system, just because people will be afraid to man up in this environment. And here's why they're going to be afraid to man up. Think of how viral internet communication is. I mean, you can destroy someone's reputation in seconds with Twitter, with social media. The ability to retaliate against people in our modern technological age is far beyond anything in the past. And so the threat level that exists is much, much higher. And so you could easily see a situation where you suppress most serious political opposition for a very long period of time, which then stifles everything long enough for power to be concentrated in a dangerous way, and it's the end of the republic at that point. So we don't necessarily have time to prove this point in the same way that we had time to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. And so there's a few other ideas that I'm advancing that I think that will be hopefully published in the next couple of months, using state sovereignty to define what the courts haven't defined. Because one of the things that states were meant to do is serve as a counterbalance to the federal government. And one of the things that states are naturally empowered to do is to protect public health and safety, which means define our rights. And if the federal court system is not going to give us clear guidance on when retaliation rises to a level that you're entitled to anonymous speech, this is a perfect opportunity for the states to step in and provide that guidance and to say that if you have a threat to your business, this is a grounds for claiming protection of the First Amendment from mandatory disclosure, and thereby creating a clear clash between any effort to prosecute under a federal disclosure law and state law, so that you get into federal court, you force the issue, you don't have to wait for decades of incremental litigation to get to that issue. So I'm recommending that one thing that states do is they start filling that gap, start passing laws to say this is protected private civic engagement, no matter what government agent wants to invade it, is protected by the First Amendment. Define it in a way that you're not in conflict with any existing case law at the federal level or the Supreme Court level, so that you can force the courts to dodge the issue that they've been dodging continuously since Citizens United and before Citizens United, so we can get clarity on it. And the reason why this is going to be effective is take a look at what happened with gay marriage. I mean, 10 years ago, everybody was against it, seemingly, right? Except gay people. States started stepping into the breach in many cases and recognizing it either by litigation or through other efforts, and other states started fighting against it. But the point is, with state sovereign involvement, you have sort of a quantum leap to getting issues recognized, resolved, changing the culture. And if the court system looks out and sees one state after another protecting private civic engagement, stopping these John Doe investigations and the wire taps and the invasions of emails and the testimony and the midnight hour invasions of homes to gather records on what free speech is engaged in, if they see state after state rising up to say that this is not permissible, you will create a culture that eventually accepts that this is not permissible in a way that's much more effective than just waiting for the issues to rise organically without that state sovereign shield. I mean, if you didn't have the issue being fought out in gay marriage in the state law environment, it probably would have been another 4 or 5 decades. However you feel about the issue, it probably would have been another 4 or 5 decades before that issue ever became ripe enough to actually be changed. So, from my perspective, it's time for us to step into the breach, to urge the development of state laws that fully flesh out what our anonymous speech rights and association rights are, to force the courts to deal with those issues, because soon we may not have the option of doing this any other way than to basically take on the Martin Luther King, Gandhi mode of peaceful resistance while you're beaten and water hosed and thrown in jail, which may or may not succeed anymore. So, folks, that's basically the presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions. Looks like we have a little time.
Does anyone have any questions?
curious, are you saying you support the concept that private, protected, non-disclosed speech should only be reserved for, the difficult things like the civil rights cases, or do you think pretty much all political speech should be able to be completely anonymous toward donors?
Well, let me, do I have to choose?
Or is there, where's the line you're drawing of where disclosure should be allowed?
Yeah,
or
from
required?
my perspective, here's where disclosure should be mandatory. If you're operating government, if you're exercising the actual mechanisms of government, like, say, ballot measure signatures, I mean, that is physically operating the mechanisms of government. Transparency there should override your private civic engagement rights, because First Amendment rights are not meant to govern governmental action. They're meant to govern private action. So I do believe in transparency, even in direct democracy, because you're exercising the mechanisms of government and private liberties are not at issue, which is not the typical object of the First Amendment. On the other hand, those things can be deliberately retaliatory, so irrational that they're really intended to suppress the underlying associative rights that are leading to those ballot signatory type actions. If they go that far, then you would even then want to restrain these mandatory disclosure laws. I mean, imagine if they required you to brand your forehead, "I signed a ballot measure," as a disclosure requirement. That would obviously be something meant to do more than just sort of bring transparency to this mechanism of government. It's meant to suppress, the activity underlying it. But as a general rule, I think if you're exercising the mechanisms of government, your First Amendment rights are attenuated. And so you can have mandatory disclosure requirements when you're exercising the mechanisms of government. And I think the founding era understanding of the First Amendment would be consistent with that. Another place where I think you can have mandatory disclosure requirements is in direct contributions to the candidate. And here's the reason why. What is a candidate? It's a job applicant. Is the government acting as a proper trustee of the public trust and not asking questions about the job applicant? And who's funding him? Where is he getting his money? Is he in some way corrupted? I mean, the reality is the position of a job applicant is a different one, closer to exercising the mechanisms of government. And certainly as to incumbents in government, requiring transparency as their direct contributions, I think, again, is something that can be done legitimately and consistently with the First Amendment. Again, that could be overdone. You could, require everybody who gives somebody a penny to have to fully disclose their entity, their name on some public website so that they get all kinds of retaliation. You can overdo those things, which is why you would still have intermediate scrutiny. You would treat it as like a parade type regulation where you're not trying to suppress anything, you're just trying to maintain the rules of the road, so long as you are requiring disclosure in the mechanisms of government and in the job application process of candidates. I think that is intermediate scrutiny, and as long as they're not going beyond that effort to simply have the minimum level of transparency that a trustee of our public trust would engage in just to do his job, that's fine. Where we get into a place where, as a general rule, you should have no mandatory disclosure at all is when you get into independent expressions of speech at any level. I mean, the government is not implicated there at all. It is purely persuasion. It is not a job applicant. It is you and I speaking independently and freely. The exact fact pattern of Citizens United should have been a no-brainer for a true originalist. And so that is where I am completely against, and I think the First Amendment is originally understood as completely against mandatory disclosure. But that's a distinction, frankly, that our side has failed to make. I mean, I'm the first guy to really articulate this distinction where mandatory disclosure is permissible and where it's not from an originalist perspective. And to some extent, the failure on our side, and when I say our side, I mean the center-right, to make this distinction is probably responsible for some of the confusion that has led to the over-regulation of independent speech and independent association. Because if you don't make that distinction clear, it all looks kind of the same, right? Everybody's engaging in politics. Who's to say that $1 million spent independently isn't something we should have transparency on, like $1 million to a candidate, right? But you have to divide at the joints and recognize that there's two fundamentally different phenomena going on. On the one hand, you're dealing with regulating government, regulating politicians in their capacity as engaging in government or engaging as politicians. On the other hand, in independent expenditures, you're regulating citizens for doing nothing more than what citizens have the private right to do. And this is a fundamental distinction in our system of freedom, at least in the original understanding of the Constitution. We are able to do things freely as private citizens without regulation as a default assumption, as a presumption of our Constitution. The same is not true about government. Government is heavily regulated as government. I mean, it's checks and balances, et cetera. So I blame my side to some extent for being overly aggressive and being anti-disclosure by fighting these ballot measure cases and basically saying if you sign a ballot measure, you don't have to be disclosed in any fashion at all. I think that's overreach on our side, and it's not surprising that courts have overreached in response. But now that the distinction is clear, that there's a distinction that's fundamental here between government mechanisms, government activity, private actions, private activity. Let's now fight for that distinction. Yes, sir.
So, if I'm to understand what you're saying, there's a huge distinction between somebody giving money directly to a candidate and somebody who is privately buying paid media to advocate for the election of a person in office.
Absolutely.
And that one should be completely disclosed and the other not.
Absolutely.
I don't get why you would think there's a big wall there. Both of them are engaging in the exact same thing, which is the election of a specific candidate.
Yeah.
It seems like a silly dichotomy to me that really has no, in today's world and elections, has no real meaning.
Yeah, I guess it's only silly if you don't see an important distinction between free private action and government action, right? I mean, if you don't see a distinction between the role of government as a public trustee or the role of a citizen in just trying to influence government to do things, which is what the role of the citizen is in a free republic, then it will look silly to you. But I submit to you that the fact that it looks silly to you is actually very dangerous. And one of the reasons why we're headed in the wrong direction, why we're having this wiretapping of people for engaging in free speech and association, why we're having paramilitary, law enforcement people raiding people's homes for what? Oh my God, they might have spent a little extra money on free speech. I mean, your perspective is dangerous. It is actually undermining the foundation of our country.
Why am I not losing my freedom by having somebody with the economic means to buy up a large portion of the paid media to advocate the election of somebody without knowing who that person is? You talk about concentration of wealth and concentration of power. I mean, that's where it's happening today, right now, with the Koch brothers and the people that want to put together $900 million to influence the next election. They determine the whole agenda at this point. We're passing XL pipeline immediately. We're having the 55th vote to overturn Obamacare. I mean, we already have an agenda set by a concentration of wealth who all gathered mountains of money to pay for media, independently.
And I hear what you're saying, but see, your premise is that there has to be a fair distribution of resources to engage in politics.
Yeah, there's a balance of power. Right?
But I'm an originalist, and I can tell you right now, the founders didn't have that perspective, and it's not anywhere in our Constitution. It's not in our First Amendment. If you want our freedoms to be limited by this sort of fair distribution of political activity concept, you need to amend the Constitution.
Where's the word disclosure in the Constitution?
Well, it shouldn't be in there by virtue of the fact that the First Amendment was enacted to prevent this kind of mandatory disclosure, where you're forcing citizens engaging in private citizen action to expose themselves to retaliation. And I mean, as I said from the beginning, when you see my paper, you'll see that you can actually go to a website today and look at the original licensing acts, and you can see how similar their mandatory disclosure and reporting requirements were in Old English to ours, and how that is, in fact, what animated, in large part, what our First Amendment is meant to do. So I'm not saying that, look, as a policy measure, is there reason to be concerned about people with great wealth having more influence in the political environment? I suppose there could be a debate over that. I personally think that you are overselling the importance of money, and I think you're underestimating the abundance of communication.
I picked up a newspaper. That's all I did.
No.
It's pretty clear looking at the agenda. I watched the Right to Work campaign here in Indiana, and we have no idea who spent millions of dollars to put our governor on TV to tell us that Right to Work was going to be a positive for the union movement in Indiana. The only person that we know is James Bopp himself,
yeah.
who organized the Opportunity Fund.
Well, we could go back and forth for a while, but my
I'm
fundamental
sorry.
response is ad hominem is a shortcut to being civic and responsible.
I
You
know.
shouldn't have to know who's spending money on something to judge the quality of the policy.
I believe, you
Yeah, I
have a
guess
question?
my question was, do you see a distinction between financial expenditure and actually, I guess, direct free speech as far as disclosure goes?
No, because except when you are in the position of giving money to a job applicant, which the government has the right to vet as any job applicant, or giving money to an incumbent who's literally the government, we have the right to regulate what government is doing and to make it transparent. So in that case, giving money to either a job applicant, i.e. a candidate, or an incumbent, I'm totally fine with. That to me is a species of transparency in government, and that's perfectly okay. We regulate the heck out of government and out of politicians. We have ethics codes, all that stuff is good. But as applied to individual citizens, we are physical entities. Things require money to speak. And anything, in my view, that is directly connected to the actual end product of speaking is protected to the same extent. And it's not just my view. I mean, even there was a time when the center-left agreed with that. I mean, it wasn't like this Buckley-Vallejo distinction that recognized money as speech was this radical right-wing idea. I mean, it actually was a fairly consensus idea. And so, you know, money, anything, it's not that money is speech. Anything that's integral to speech is protected like speech. Otherwise, you can't have speech.
I'm gonna have Sam and then Jairus, and then back there, and then.
I haven't read your article, I'm looking forward to it, but, and I'm not as familiar with the licensing acts, but beyond the summary that you gave.
Yep.
But if that is the basis you're theorizing for the First Amendment, for the freedom of the press, how does that then connect also to freedom of speech, which is a separate clause
Yeah.
in the first?
Oh boy, you want me to talk for a long time. All right. Well, here's the way that I think that the founders thought about these issues. First of all, it's a mistake to do what Scalia does, which is insist on evidence of actual positive law protection of a right before recognizing it as a constitutional right. Because the founders, one of the main opposition arguments to a Bill of Rights was that we could never specify all the rights that are going to be protected. And so the idea that Scalia has, that we have to actually go and look and find a colonial era law that said we have the right to have free speech anonymously before we can find it to be intended to be part of the First Amendment, is mistaken. The perspective of the founding era was that private, non-injurious conduct is generally presumed to be something you can do without any governmental interference. And so, at the same time, however, we can look at the Bill of Rights and we can get sort of pointers on what their contours were in that area. Because it's very hard to know today, like, where would gay marriage fall in this spectrum? You know, so the way that I argue is what you do is you look at the Bill of Rights is basically articulating the general contour of the underlying conception of ordered liberty. Now, this is a term that you'll see in case law. The underlying conception is broader, subsumes more things than what is articulated, but what is articulated shapes the category. And so the way I would answer that question is I would ask, is there anything fundamentally different from the founding era perspective between free speech outside of the licensing of a press and freedom of the press, that the founders would not include that act within the concept of freedom of press as one of the things in the category that freedom of press was instantiating? And if there's nothing fundamentally different, I would argue that the founders would have anticipated that to be protected by the First Amendment. And I would argue that there is nothing fundamentally different about other aspects of free private speech, because the thing that freedom of the press is trying to protect, the underlying concept, is this ability to engage in private civic expression, or private expression in general, private action that doesn't cause harm to others, whether it's speech or anything else, I believe was meant to be protected by the Bill of Rights, and we know that from the Ninth Amendment. So, you know, now we can't go crazy with that. We can't, you know, there are certain very specific things listed in the Bill of Rights that are hard to understand, you know, what the width of the category is. Like, for example, the right to a jury trial. I mean, that is very nominalistic. You don't know, it's unlikely that was meant to signal an underlying broader category, right? It's very specific. So there are some rights concepts in the Bill of Rights that really are just what they say they are, and there are other rights concepts that are signaling an underlying broader category. And the challenge is to look at what the founders said and what the public understood at the time to see what the difference is. And we know that in the case of freedom of the press and the First Amendment, they were very much concerned about press, but they were thinking of press as an instantiation of speech, of association, of everything else. And so their underlying category protected by the First Amendment, I think, is very clearly broader than just the press, just political speech, just political activity. I hope that made sense. I'm very sleep deprived.
The question would be, do you view monies given to advertisement or PACs in the same way as you would view monies given to political parties that are coordinated but not funding individual candidate campaigns?
The question of political parties is a very challenging one, because in one sense you could see them as cartels operating the mechanisms of government because of the barriers to entry that have been created to third parties getting into the system. I don't know where I stand on that yet. I'm open to the possibility that political parties, to the extent that they create barriers to entry in the system for other political parties to emerge, that maybe they have to have a lot of mandatory transparency there, but if they drop away and stop barring third parties from getting into the system, as they have a history of doing, then I would say that then they're not a cartel operating the mechanisms of government so much, and then you wouldn't have the same degree of transparency. So political parties, to me, but you know what the ironic thing is in campaign finance law? Political parties are actually some of the freest and most secretive elements of our political campaign system. So the exact place where you would think you'd have the best argument for transparency is exactly where you don't see it, which is one of the reasons why you should be very skeptical of anybody who argues for regulation, because generally, regulation of anything, speech or anything else, is actually in the interests of those being regulated. They're actually there to create barriers to entry to the less sophisticated, and they can navigate it just fine with their attorneys and their accountants. So parties, maybe there should be mandatory disclosure if they're abusing the system and keeping third parties out. PACs are different. PACs, apart from parties, PACs are just groups of individuals spending their own money. And that, to me, is purely private. It has nothing to do with the mechanisms of government. They're not running for office and they're not in office. So the default understanding, at least from an originalist perspective, should be they're free to do whatever they want, even if they want to do it anonymously.
Can you give,
Yeah.
Can you give just an example of how, of the lack of transparency with party finance?
Well, a friend of mine over at Illinois Policy Institute brought a lawsuit in Illinois. Illinois has a very complicated system of disclosure for PACs and for independent citizens groups, for campaign contributions and how it's spent and where it goes. Virtually nothing for political parties. I mean, like literally they are exempt, explicitly exempt from the same categories of disclosure. And at the same time, it's very hard to get on the ballot as a new party in Illinois. And that's not an accident. So, I mean, you could find, in fact, I wouldn't know of a state that imposed transparency on a political party. I don't know of it. And there used to be good reasons for it. When the ballot access was, more liberal, more open, then they're just another group of citizens. I don't have any problem with not having, transparency. But once they become a cartel, once they're entrenched and protected from competition, and using the mechanisms of government to maintain that, they're in a different place. They're like a public utility.
Yeah, I have a two-part question. I think, at least it seems to me, that you're advocating for a very specific thing, that the exception of right to secrecy should be the rule, but that two things that you're doing, making a little confusing about what you think that rule actually is. So first, and I just want to clarify if I have this right. So one, you keep talking about the right of citizens to free speech and persons,
Right.
but what you're actually advocating is an extension of Citizens United, a rejection of the focus on disclosure, to say that there's a right of corporations to engage in unlimited political expenditures in secret. So that's the first part of the question. The second is you keep talking about scary facts that seem to be not at all relevant to the principle, the rule that you're advocating for, like paramilitary invasions of homes, you know, which nobody supports, I don't think, on any side of this. But more to the point, in Citizens United, you talked at length about the documentary at issue about Hillary. The point, really, of critics of Citizens United has nothing to do with that. The point is, as Justice Stevens said in dissent, the majority didn't decide it on the facts of the documentary. And Justice Stevens says, the court asked itself a question that wasn't presented by the parties that had nothing to do with the documentary and whether that was protected. It was instead whether private corporations have a right to engage in unlimited political expenditures. And the court said yes, but they have to disclose. And so that takes me back to the first part, which is the thrust of your rule is corporations, isn't it, that corporations would have a First Amendment right to engage in unlimited political expenditures in secret, which I teach First Amendment law, undermines the fundamental theory of a marketplace of ideas and democratic self-rule, in my view.
Well, I understand your perspective. Let me give you the perspective of an originalist. The reason why Kennedy and the gang went and reached beyond the specific fact pattern is the perspective of an originalist is one of a system of constitutional law for the ages. In other words, when a originalist generally looks at a freedom, and particularly in the First Amendment context, they ask themselves what principle would be established if we didn't rule the way we did. Would, in the long run, this result in things that are clearly an undermining of the underlying freedom? So they looked at the instantiation, this documentary, and they realized that if they were to only rule on this documentary, then the absence of any further guidance would in and of itself chill future speech. People wouldn't know whether they were free to do the web PowerPoint within 60 days of an election, and that would have to be litigated. And then they wouldn't know if they could be on talk radio within 60 days, and then they would have no. So what they recognize is that it would actually undermine freedom of speech, create even more confusion in the law if they failed to reach out and clarify the entire field of communication in that context. So that's the perspective the court had. I agree with that perspective. I think I'm against narrow rulings in a free speech context. I can respect them outside of a free speech context, but what's different about a free speech context is the chilling effect concern that we have. And so the court always needs to be thinking not only, how do I resolve this fact pattern correctly, but how will this resolution affect the behavior of people in their communicative activities in other fact patterns? And if in fact limiting themselves to this fact pattern would create more confusion and create more of a chilling effect, then that would actually be unconstitutional for them to do, because they're governed by the First Amendment as well. And that was part of Kennedy's argument. So you and I kind of have a different philosophy of what's right to do in a First Amendment case. On the corporation side, frankly, I just don't understand why getting limited liability deprives you of your freedom of speech. I mean, just because three of us do something together without a corporation and we can do whatever we want, pool our money, and that's all okay, but the moment I get this little certificate that says that third parties can't sue for my personal assets, I lose all those rights. I don't understand the logic. It's a non sequitur to me. If you believe that individuals as groups have the right to freely speak when they're not incorporated, someone's going to have to explain to me what is magical about limited liability that suddenly means you don't have that right.
Last question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I mean, today newspapers, they're dying. They're a dying thing. The internet has become the biggest means of communication. Anyone from their mom's basement can put a video online and get 1 million people, watching them, for no money.
This is my point.
They just put it up there, and they probably have a wider audience than even a newspaper, a local newspaper does. I was just wondering, do you have any fears of, potentially it becomes, the more public a figure you are, the more you get penalized, the more you are. I'm just interested to see your outlook on the internet and how that will affect this very topic.
Well, here's the thing. This is actually in part a response to your claim. I mean, the reality is the Koch brothers have nothing that they can compete with some cute kitty video that is, advocating some sort of politician or political issue. That kiddie video is gonna get more hits than the biggest amount of money that the Kochs could throw at any crazy AFP effort. And so we're in a different place with technology today. It's just not plausible or persuasive to me that there's this degree of scarcity in communications assets that there may have used to be. So that's why I think that even apart from constitutional issues, the policy argument that you're making is much weaker today than it was 40 years ago. But to your point, what's interesting is that there's tremendous ability to do great harm to people in this circumstance. But to me, that's a different issue. The founders were perfectly okay with defamation litigation. It's a modern development of the First Amendment doctrine to start limiting the ability to sue under defamation claims. Because again, the founders' conception of freedom is you're free to do anything you want as long as you're not injuring others. And the concept of a reputation was viewed as a form of property, so they didn't have any problem, limiting your free speech and damaging other people's reputation when it was malicious and false and so on, even when it wasn't false. So I don't. That's a different discussion. I don't know where to go with it, but I would say that look, a kiddie video can outcompete the Kochs quite often. I think what's really unfair in our political environment are people who are ugly and can't do really good kiddie videos.
On that, well, can I just make a comment, because I know the 1Ls have class at like 1:15, it's about 1 o'clock, so if you have class and you'd like to leave, you can go ahead and do so now, so that way, because I know a few people left. And I guess this would be the last question we do. Have a timeline in terms of getting him out of here, because he has an event at 2 o'clock.
I keep rolling around this economic retaliation that you keep speaking of, which seems like what you're trying to protect people from free speech and the ability. Then you say that there's no difference really between creating an LLC and an individual speech, and there really shouldn't be. But aren't really what you're saying is that the freedom of speech ought to be free, and the corporations that are doing it ought to be able to do it, even though their speech is governed by the fact that they're required to make a profit. So they're basically engaging in commerce, but that somehow we should have no disclosure so that people can't retaliate economically and basically aren't provided the information. Aren't I harmed in my freedom as a consumer not knowing that the corporations that I support with my funds are out maybe advocating and pushing policies that are not in my best interest? Aren't I losing freedom in that proposition?
Well, not if you're not a shareholder. You don't have any stake in the entity. But if you were
They're
a shareholder,
influencing policy. I'm a shareholder by being a voter in the country.
no, you're asking is a corporation somehow taking freedom away from you if you're not a shareholder and all you do is buy a hamburger from McDonald's? And I'm saying no, it doesn't take some freedom away. You could buy a hamburger from Burger King. But if you're a shareholder, I actually thought one of the stronger arguments that the center-left raised in one of their amicus briefs in Citizens United was that there was an implied fiduciary duty to shareholders in a publicly held corporation not to spend it on controversial political issues, because you should assume that that you have to represent everyone's interests equally unless you have a clear statement in your bylaws or something like that. I thought that was actually a very persuasive argument. I think that a very strong argument could still be made if the left wouldn't overreach all the time and just want to smash everybody who has a corporation and wants to talk. That a default fiduciary rule in corporate law would be that unless you make it very clear in your bylaws that you intend to engage in political activity, you cannot engage in political activity. I don't have any problem with that, but you have to leave open the fact that people could then adjust their bylaws, and then you might just get what you don't like anyhow. For me, it's a question of what are the rights at issue? Is it truly private, independent action? If it is, unless you're harming someone, you should be able to do it. That's what the founders believed. If it's governmental action or close to governmental action, then you get into a different argument. That's my position.
Okay, well, thank you so much.